Sister Natalie, for that. And also, thank you so much for standing there in that awkward silence. Those of us who stand up at the microphone know exactly what it feels like, especially when we're doing special music, when there's operating difficulties and the computer just doesn't want to work, and you standing there, and then you try to fill in for that minute. You're hoping that every second becomes an hour, and then thankfully, it wasn't that hot today, so you don't get the flop sweat. So yes, I want to thank you again, Sister Natalie. It was a very beautiful piece, and I appreciate it, which again goes to the reason why I keep things low tech, because you don't have to reboot. Piece of paper. As always, anytime I'm always in front of the microphone, usually for a very different reason, but for some reason, and every time I'm at the mic, I always just say what I want and do what I want because I can. But yet they still want me to preach, so I guess I must be doing something right. So of course I must give my requisite shout outs to my New Jerusalem family that are here, as well as my family in Florida, and I think my brother and sister who are in Turkey are watching as well. My Aunt Carol, of course, who made sure to call me to let me know that she couldn't come today, although she wanted to, but to also give her a shout out, because I know she's watching as well in Staten Island. So if in case, and even the visitors who were at my mom's house for the Pensante watch party, I welcome you as well. I believe Sister Loretta, you're there, so you get a shout out as well. So like I said, you put me in front of the mic, this is what you get. So I'm going to just jump right in now. At this point, I think I wasted enough of your time, and I hope that my words will give you something to think about. As always, when I have something to say, I try to speak for what's something that I found interesting, or something that I think someone may need to hear at that time. So I leave it in God's hands, and He usually gives me something, or something will strike me funny, in which then I start to expound on. And who knows, again, if anything I say might inspire you to talk to a friend or a neighbor or a family member who needs to hear those words, then so much the better. To God always is the glory. So the title of my sermon, which is kind of not exactly the best of titles, but the title I came up with was "Can Science and Religion Coexist?" This is a question that has plagued the religious and scientific communities for centuries. An example of this conflict was in 1616, when the Catholic Church persecuted Galileo Galilei for his support of the heliocentric model of the universe, which placed the sun at the center instead of the earth, which was in direct conflict with the teachings of the Church at that time. Fast forward to modern times, and of course, we all know Galileo was 100% correct, and that science won that argument. But what then were the implications? We'll get back to that in a moment. I'm a big fan of Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's an astrophysicist who is rather famous for being an author and scientific commentator. I love watching clips of his podcasts on social media and YouTube. I also admire that he does not shy away from answering questions about religion, and although he does not personally believe in God, the concept of God, he does admit that there are many scientists who do, and he does not condemn or belittle them for their beliefs. He stated publicly that God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance, and that faith is a belief in the absence of evidence. He often contrasts science which is evidence-based, with religion, which he sees as relying on faith. This is the basis of God in the gaps argument, in which Tyson explains the idea of God is used to fill in the gaps in scientific understanding. But as science advances, this pocket of ignorance shrinks. Also, he notes that faith is a term used specifically for believing in something without evidence, and that science, in contrast, is based on what can be observed and measured. Here is where we differ, because the God in the gaps argument was the catch-all to the many wonders of the natural world that man was unable to explain or fully understand. So it had to be God. But where he misses the mark is the science community wants us to agree with the more that we can observe and master in our understanding of how things are formed and how they work, the less we need to rely on the idea of God as the creator. The problem is that this argument is flawed because one has absolutely nothing to do with the other. As an example, I point to the plagues of Egypt found in Exodus chapters 7 through 10. The plagues of Egypt are described in the Bible as a series of divine punishments, but scientific explanations suggest that they may in fact have been a cascade of natural events potentially triggered by a volcanic eruption or climate change. The first plague, water turns to blood, most likely caused by a large algae bloom called red tide, or an influx of red clay and silt from a drought could have poisoned and discolored the Nile River so that it would have appeared as blood. The second plague, frogs, as a natural effect of the initial algae bloom or other water pollution that killed fish, which are a food source for frogs. Frogs then left the water in large numbers. The third and fourth plagues, lice and flies, as a result of the deaths of the fish and the frogs, would have created a breeding ground for insects like lice, fleas, and gnats, which are attracted to decaying matter. The fifth and sixth plagues, livestock, pestilence, and boils, as a result of the insects that could have carried disease that sickened and killed livestock, also a theory supported by an ancient papyrus describing acid burns. The same infections might have caused boils in humans. The seventh plague, hail, most likely caused by a volcanic eruption, which could have caused a massive ash cloud in the atmosphere leading to hailstorms. The eighth plague, locusts, which are known to appear after periods of disturbance and may have been attracted to the damaged vegetation caused by the hailstorms. The ninth plague, darkness, the same volcanic ash that caused the hail, could have created a period of prolonged darkness that can be felt, similar to the dust or volcanic storm. The 10th plague, death of the firstborn. Some theories suggest this was caused by a toxic mold that grew on food, especially since the firstborn might have been given the best and potentially moldy food during the famine, or other explanation is there is no naturalistic explanation for this event in the biblical narrative. On this, science backs up its claims by offering several natural occurrences, proposes that the plagues could have followed a sequence starting with the Nile River turning red from algae or silt, which killed fish, and thus the need for an overabundance of frogs, which drove them out of the river and onto land. Then, as the food source diminished, this in turn would have led to a lot of dead frogs, and the inevitable insect infestations causing livestock disease and possibly human illness. Other events like hail and darkness are potentially explained by volcanic ash and dust in the atmosphere from the eruption of the Santorini volcano, which science has said occurred sometime around 1600 BCE. These possible scientific explanations for the plagues make a very convincing argument for taking God out of the narrative, because one could argue that all Moses needed to know was some simple natural causalities in order to manipulate the narrative and somehow fool Pharaoh into freeing his people. But it fails to acknowledge that God, as the creator of the universe, set up very precise system of nature, and just because science can explain how the plagues happen does not take away anything from them, because they are actually more proof of the sovereignty of our Creator. Let me explain by first asking the question: if God created the earth and set up many complex systems for keeping it self-sustaining that we can observe, then why wouldn't he use those very same systems to demonstrate his power? Stated another way, there were never meant to be a mutually exclusive arguments. The first was the demonstration of the power and sovereignty of God, which is the philosophical equivalent of who God is and what he can do. And the other was the manifestation of that power, or the physical, which was how God did it. God does not have to break the natural laws of nature which he created to demonstrate his power. Another example of God causing something miraculous, but in contrast to my previous assertion, and might be considered as God breaking his own laws of nature, is found in the book of Joshua, chapter 10, verses 12 through 14. It reads as follows. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it was written in the book of Jahashar. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. Now these verses tell of a time when the earth seemingly stopped spinning, so that there was no sunset and darkness of night for a full day. As fantastic as and awe-inspiring as this sounds, the reality is quite the opposite. From our current understanding of the delicate balance of gravity, which comes from the rotation of the earth, the change in season based on the tilt of the earth on its axis, and the tides linked to the moon's orbit around the earth, it is plain to see that this would have been a very impractical solution. Science explains that if the earth were to suddenly stop spinning, the most immediate and devastating effects would be caused by inertia. Everything not anchored to the bedrock would be flung eastward at speeds of over 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, thus creating hypersonic winds, massive tsunamis, and immense global destruction. If that was not bad enough, after this initial catastrophe, the oceans would migrate to the poles. Extreme temperature differences would occur between the sunlit and dark sides of the planet, and days would end up lasting for as long as a year. So how can this be? Although I do believe that God could absolutely stop the earth from spinning and could hold back all of the catastrophic events that would occur, but why do all of that if there is a much more simpler way to accomplish the same ends without any of the mayhem and destruction? How, you may ask? The answer is that instead of the daylight coming from the sun, it was God himself who was the source of the light. I say this because if you look at Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good and separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault, and it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And so it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered waters he called seas. Then God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land, and bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds." And it was. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, the trees bearing fruit with seed and according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be light in the vault of the sky, and to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the sun, the lesser light to govern the night, which we know to be the moon. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light to the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. I hazard to guess that all of you here have heard or read these same verses several times. But if you were really paying attention, you would note God created light on the first day, but the sun was not created until day 4. Wait a second. When we look outside in the day, it's the sun that's the source of light, isn't it? Even in Galileo's time, his prosecutors in the church knew this to be fact. So what is the Bible saying? Was this a mistake? Not at all. God himself was the light. And if that was the case in Genesis, then why wouldn't that also be the case in Joshua? Besides, to me at least, is not that a much more stupendous manifestation of God's power? That it was the very light from creation that Joshua was seeing, but mistook for something as ordinary as the sun, which rises and sets every day. The next argument of scientists is one of morality, namely that of the Creator. Getting back to Dr. Tyson, he questions whether a being beyond human comprehension can be bound by human concepts, like morality, arguing that the presence of suffering in the universe challenges the idea of an all-good and all-powerful deity. On this, he contrasts science's commitment to evidence with religious philosophy, stating that if data conflicts with religious beliefs, some may ignore that data to fit their philosophy. And when specifically asked about his own beliefs, he has said that he remains unconvinced of the existence of God because he looks for evidence and doesn't find it, though he believes that what he thinks about God is irrelevant to others. What he is basically alluding to is describing the Epicurean paradox, also known as the problem of evil, which is a philosophical argument questioning the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God. It states that if such a God exists, then evil and suffering should not be in the world. However, since evil and suffering do exist, then either God is not all-powerful, not all-knowing, or not all-good. The paradox challenges the ability to reconcile the existence of a benevolent, omnipotent deity with the reality of pain and suffering in the world. As stated, the paradox can be broken down into a series of questions and their implications. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing, can he prevent evil? The logical answer, most emphatically, must be yes, because God absolutely has the knowledge and power to do so. If God is all-loving, does he not want to prevent evil? Again, yes, because why wouldn't a perfectly loving being not want to eliminate suffering? Since evil exists, what does this imply about God's attributes? It is the contradiction that suggests that a God who is simultaneously omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent cannot exist. Let's explore the origins of this line of thought and its conclusions. While named after the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BCE, the specific wording of the paradox was preserved by later Christian writers, particularly Lactantius. This introduces skepticism, which some scholars believe the argument was more characteristic of skeptics or was philosophical argument against the concept of an all-powerful, benevolent deity rather than the statement from Epicurus himself. Why this matters is because the paradox remains a central challenge in philosophy and theology, because it forces a consideration of the nature of divinity and the human experience of suffering. Various attempts have been made to reconcile the existence of evil with the attributes of God, often through theological explanations like the concept of free will or other philosophical frameworks. There is no consensus, however, on whether scientific discovery negates God or that the relationship between science and religion is a subject of ongoing debate with various perspectives. Science operates within a natural physical world, while the concept of God typically considers supernatural or metaphysical existing outside the boundaries of scientific measurement and observation. I'm not alone in this, and there are arguments that science and religion are compatible. One such argument is that they are of different domains, which is a widely held view described by paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould as non-overlapping magisteria, which propose that science and religion have separate authorities. Science investigates the natural world and answers how questions, such as the mechanisms of the universe. And separate from that, religion, on the other hand, addresses why questions concerning meaning, purpose, and morality. By examining both sides from this perspective, the two realms do not conflict at all, and a new scientific finding cannot, by definition, negate the theological claim. There are also several scientists who point to science as a tool for understanding creation, because for many religious believers, specific scientific discovery does not negate God, but rather illuminates the work of a divine creator. Historically, many pioneering scientists, including Sir Isaac Newton, who was actually one of Dr. Tyson's personal heroes, were also were people of faith who viewed their work as exploring the laws set by God. There is also the concept of the fine-tuning argument, in which some believers suggest that the precise physical constants and conditions of the universe, which are necessary for life to exist, point to an intelligent designer, and it's from this perspective every new discovery that reveals the universe's complexity can be seen as further evidence for a creator. The inconvenient truth is that in addition to being all-powerful, God is perfect, which means that in the system that he created, there is no room for good or bad. It is us who wrongfully ascribe the good and bad designations because of our own selfishness. Think of the lion. Studies suggest that lions hunting in groups have a success rate of about 30%, while those hunting alone have a much lower success rate, between 17 and 19%. But what do lions have to do with the argument of good and bad? This is precisely my point. The more successful the lion or lions are at hunting, the better chance they and their young have at survival. This is good, right? But turn things slightly, in this same scenario, this is not at all good for that poor animal that's being eaten. So which is it? I know this can be very confusing, but there is a very simple and convenient scientific explanation for why it is both and neither. If left unchecked, the populations of those animals who are prey to the lions would totally destroy all the balance, the delicate balance of the ecosystem in which they live, and by extension, bring about their own demise in the process. So you see, God in his wisdom created a world to be self-sustaining and, when needed, self-correcting. If you're still skeptical, because I used an example from the animal world, I'll give you an example of what happened to me personally. And I promised Aunt Carol I'd let her know, so if you don't have the tissues yet, you better get them now. I tend to talk about my father and his passing quite a bit. It is one of the central things that happened in my life, one of the probably worst that I can say to among a number of other things. So, of course, losing one's father, as I'm sure everybody who's lost a parent or a loved one, a child, etc., that's usually considered very, very bad. There's never anything good about losing someone, especially someone as loved and cherished as a parent. But it happened. And so to me and to my family, this was a horrible event. But think about it from another perspective. My father, he was old. He was in a lot of pain, especially in the later years of his life. And he was always a very proud man who never wanted to be kept alive on machines. He never wanted to be confined to a wheelchair. He did use a walker, and he loved riding around on a scooter, but being confined to a wheelchair was not, or bed, was definitely not something that was in his plan for his life. So I believe, and as many in my family believe, that God in his mercy allowed him to have that stroke, because we think that maybe something, maybe soon, might have happened to him that would have caused him to be exactly that, maybe in worse pain, or to be in some sort of quadriplegic state or paralytic state. So, like I said, in his mercy, he allowed my father to rest. We all believed he was healthy enough to have lived a lot longer. But again, so was this good or was this bad? Well, again, it all depends. To me, it was horrible. But to my father, it was mercy. And I don't know about you, but anytime I've seen mercy, I've always known it to be good. And of course, as I love to say, my father, we think his last conscious deeds on earth were him praying his usual prayer list. And I don't know about you, but if I had to go out, if the last thing on my lips was a prayer, I'm pretty sure that's probably the best way. And it's one of those things that I admire most about my father, and hope one day that my faith will hold as strong as his, and when it's my time, that I can go praising the Lord and giving thanks to him. So getting back to the argument of good and bad, and why it's so important for the atheist to remove God and faith. By removing God, you can, in essence, remove all responsibility for sin. For if there is no God, then the concept of sin, being in contrast to his law, becomes null. On the surface, this can sound very freeing. Imagine no need for law and the guilt associated with breaking it. But does it really end there? This leads to my last point, and that is a brief look at the idea of idols and why we find it so easy to create them and allow them to control our lives. It's my belief that man worships idols as a mean to ultimately have control over God, or whatever concept of a higher power they ascribe to. In general, it's not hard to propose that man mostly doesn't have much issue with worshiping and or trusting in something greater than themselves. But this only holds true as long as that control conforms to our own wants and desires. The idol is merely a mirror of ourselves, and what makes idols so attractive is that they take all the responsibility of our actions, because we do not understand God and his plan, and as such we tend to fear what is out of our control. Idols come in a variety of forms, both physical or tangible, such as money, possessions, physical satisfactions, statues, etc., and conceptual or intangible, such as power, fame, security. Even piety can be an idol. Yes, the very act of being religious could be an idol, because to the person who uses God's laws and religious traditions to condemn others and, by extension, oppress them or attempt to make their beliefs punishable, They circumvent the very godly concept of free will and have turned the focus from God to one of self-aggrandizement. I will close with a passage from Job, which I believe perfectly sums everything up. It comes from Job chapter 38, where the Lord reveals his omnipotence to Job. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched a line upon it? What were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band? When I fixed my limit for it, and set the bars and doors?" Going on to 17. "Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Or have you seen doors or shadows of death? Have you comprehended at the breadth of the earth? Tell me, if you know all this. Where is the way to dwelling of light and darkness? Where is its place, that you may take it to its territory, that you may know the paths to its home? Do you know it because you were born, or because the number of your days is great?" Going down to verse 33. "Do you have the ordinance of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that an abundance of water cover you? Can you send the lightnings, that they may do and say to you, 'Here we are'? Who has put wisdom in the mind, or has given understanding to the heart? Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens, or lurk in their lairs and lie wait? Who provides food for the raven when the young ones cry to God and wander about for the lack of food?" The passage goes on for the next chapter and touches on the animals and other aspects of nature that are under God's command. In the end, by observing the world around us and all of the marvelous components that must work together in perfect harmony, how could we not draw the conclusion of a Creator God who has perfectly set the universe in motion, and, if we allow Him, can steer us into our own perfection as well?